Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. This is me, Dr. Salman Abdel Jalil, and this is the third in our series of revision classes. We have done two revision classes already, and this is our third. We're likely to have one tomorrow, and with the class that we will have tomorrow, we will conclude our series. I'm hopeful that you find those revision classes interesting and useful, and I'm hopeful that they are not taking much of your time because I know how busy you are. It's not only AA100A that you're having; you also have other courses. Anyway, let's get to what we plan to do today. Like I said, it's Ireland that we're having today. I have received so many requests about Ireland and the fact that it's bulky and heavy-handed and everything, and people are under the false impression that they have to memorize stuff, which I don't. Um, um, I'm trying to say that there is nothing that you would memorize, and just understand stuff, just understand things very thoroughly, and then you are on your way. You don't have to memorize anything. Okay. Okay, so it's analysis that we're asking you to do in the final exam. It's also not copying and pasting. It's not, please mute your mic. It's also, yesterday, if you still remember, I warned you against this bad practice of memorizing, whole essays off the internet and then putting them as is in the exam. So you and your friend and perhaps a third person and a fourth, we end up having replicas, having copies of the same essay. In this case, you will be penalized, and this will be considered cheating. I don't want you to memorize ready-made essays. Ready-made essays are wrong for the simple reason that they do not address that we have in this semester. Okay, how can you have ready-made essays and you don't know what the questions are yet? So it makes sense that if you do that, if you insist on memorizing stuff as is and putting it in the exam, that you're not going to get the mark that you aspire for. Anyway, let's like I said, let's go all the way to the chapter. I'm sure you have done enough, reviewing. Perhaps we can start with some questions and then proceed with the most important ideas and items in the chapter. So, do you have any questions on the chapter that you would like me to go to straight away? No questions? Does it mean that you haven't started studying the chapter yet? You haven't gone to the point where the chapter is behind you? You're still working on other chapters?
Doctor,
Yes.
I just want to ask you about what is the most important point in these chapters.
This is what
And
we're getting to in a minute.
okay, thank
Okay.
you, thank
You're
you.
welcome. Any?
Doctor,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but the chapters are too heavy for us. Like it has a lot of information. Can you please at least tell us what book we should focus more, please? Like what book we should put focus?
No, I don't do that. I revise with you. I go over the material, but I don't recommend courses of action as what to proceed with and what to skip. I mean, the idea of skipping chapters is very dangerous, and I wouldn't fall into this trap. If you have, I mean, you do your what you're supposed to do. You study them, and if you have any questions, we can always, talk about them and answer them. But for me to advise you to skip chapters, no, I wouldn't do it. What's your
Okay.
name? I'm sorry. What's your name?
Lujain.
Lujain.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Lujain. Are you from Jeddah or
No,
Riyadh?
Riyadh. No, Riyadh.
From Riyadh. Okay, Lujain. Thank you. Haneen is raising her hand. Go
Doctor,
ahead.
Yes.
Yes.
Uh, Doctor, what kind of question we can have about the Erlang chapter?
Raise your voice.
What kind of question could we have in the exam about Erlang chapter?
Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay.
can I ask you, Doctor?
Yes, ask me. What's your
Okay.
name? What's your name?
Hamdan.
I'm sorry. There is noise in the background.
I'm sorry for the noise, but
You either control the noise or you mute the mic. Okay. Can we have somebody else?
now it's okay, Doctor.
Okay, go ahead. What's your name?
My name is Tuqal Hamdan from Riyadh branch. I want to ask
Okay.
you if you will, who will from doctors مين حيصحح الورق تبعنا مش عارفة أقولها بالإنجلش.
Does it make any difference where we apply the same criteria, whether me or Miss Noha, it's the same thing. You shouldn't be obsessed with who is going to mark your papers because we apply the same criteria. You don't have to worry about it. You are in safe hands. Don't worry.
And the timbers of final exams, we have 3 questions and we have to choose one from each one.
I'm not sure I heard that part. Go ahead. Can you say it again?
In the timbers of final exams that we already saw, that there is a 3 question and you have from each one choose one.
I'm not sure. I mean, the BCC has already sent you the exam format. Read it very thoroughly and very carefully, and you are on your way. Every semester has its own way. You shouldn't be inspired by previous semesters when it comes to the ideas and when it comes to the procedures. Every semester is different. So you're advised to check the email that the BCC sent about the format and the style of the final exam.
They said that it will be 2 questions and each question has 2 and you have to choose one. But
if this is what on if this is what is on LMS and if this is what the BCC sent, that's fine. If not, you need to double check with the BCC.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so enough procedural issues and let's get down to business. Okay, we'll talk about Ireland. And we have done Ireland on a number of in a number of sessions. We had like 3 sessions doing Ireland. I'm not sure whether they were 2 or 3. And when I say Ireland, what comes to your mind? So what are the associations of Ireland to you now that you have watched the recordings, now that you have read the chapter, now that you're preparing for the final, you're preparing for a final in which Ireland may feature prominently. So when I say Ireland, what comes to your mind? Ireland.
Easter Rising.
Come to the mic, identify yourself, and say what you have to say.
Potato plate.
What?
Potato plate.
Potato what? French fries? Okay. So you mean the Irish famine, the potato famine of 1845?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Luai. What else? So, of course, let me jump on what Luai is saying about the potato famine of 1845. Let me say that this event was very transformational. It took the Irish perhaps 5 years to survive and go behind it. And of course, it wasn't without a very heavy cost, a very heavy cost for the Irish and also for the English or for the British. So, what cost did the Irish pay? It was a heavy cost. I mean, you had, hundreds and perhaps thousands of casualties, people who uh, were starved to death, and lots of people died, and lots of other people had to immigrate, have to travel outside the country for better prospects and for better living conditions. The heavy cost that the British paid for this for the mishandling and the mismanagement of the Irish famine was the fact that the Irish were, and for the first time, adamant about not having home government under British rule. They started to think of something else. They started to think of complete independence, total independence of and from the British rule. So that so this is how transformational the potato famine and the potato plight was. Before the famine, Ireland was something, and after the famine, Ireland became something else. Before the famine, the Irish were or would settle for home government, a government that is ruled, that is masterminded by people like themselves, Irish people, under British rule. But after the famine, and after the mismanagement of the famine on the part of the British, they decided that they should seek complete independence, which they got, as you know, in 1920 something, right? Okay, any other ideas? So thank you, Luai, for raising this issue up, the idea of the potato famine and how transformational it was in the history of Ireland. Okay, let's start the story right from the very beginning if you guys don't have any questions. So we're talking about Ireland, and Ireland happens to be a country in North Europe, and it is to the west of Britain. You know, Britain, perhaps Britain is more known than Ireland. So whether we're talking about Ireland or Britain, we're talking about islands surrounded by water from everywhere. So Britain at one point would take over Ireland. Take over means that they would occupy Ireland, and Ireland would stay or remain under British occupation for hundreds of years. Okay, so obviously, occupation is not a good thing. Okay, so everybody knows how the occupiers and the occupying forces treat the natives of the occupied lands. We have examples even in the Middle East. I mean, at one point our countries were also occupied, and we see how brutal the occupiers are. And this happens, and this applies to Ireland. It was under a British occupation for hundreds of years. And at one point, they would decide that this is not working for them. Why would they stay under occupation when they can have independence and they become a free country like the rest of the world? And this is exactly what they did. But of course, they did it in a gradual manner. It didn't happen overnight, and it took lots of sacrifices and lots of violence and lots of blood, unfortunately. Okay, so when did they come? I mean, the official occupation would take place with Cromwell, and Cromwell used to be, you know, not a king, was perhaps for the first and the last time in the history of Britain, he was the ruler, and he was a Republican ruler, where for this very brief period, Britain became a republic and not a monarchy or a kingdom. So it all started um, with Cromwell in the 17th century. And ever since Ireland became under British occupation, they would try from time to time to kind of free themselves from this occupation, but they wouldn't succeed. What is it that the English or the British were trying in order to perhaps uh, um, resist the urge for independence that the Irish had? They would obliterate their identity. Obliterate means that they would delete their history and identity. They, of course, would impose their language, the English language, on the Irish. And the next thing you know is that the Irish would speak English to communicate, to get education, and also to produce culture, whether we're talking about poetry, literature. So the official language would be English. So when people are born in Ireland, the Irish people, when they are born, they are born using the English language and knowing only about the history of the British Empire. There is no access to Irish history. And like I said, the British occupiers made sure that there is this distance and this gap between the Irish and their history and their legacies. Okay, this will take place for hundreds of years until we come to the 18th century, where people would start to think differently. You will have new generations of people, and they would ask for home government. They would ask for home rule. Home rule means that they want to rule themselves as Irish, but under British rule, under the British Empire. And that was not even granted, and this was not even accepted by the British. Anyway, over time, people would have more awareness, and they would ask for home government until something very transformational happens, and they would shift from asking for home government under British rule to complete independence and total independence. independence. And like I said, it was the Irish famine of 1845, and it was also the brutal and the violent events of 1916. These are two transformational, events that would shift the interest of the Irish from home government under British rule to complete independence. Okay, this is in a nutshell what the chapter is about. The chapter is about this these events, and also about the chapter provides these events as context for something the writers consider bigger, which is the idea of tailoring and tweaking tradition in order to serve purposes, whether these purposes are political or otherwise. So the focus in the chapter is on proving that tradition can and history can be perhaps altered, can be presented in a way that is not very truthful or genuine in order to serve political purposes. Whether the writers of the chapter are correct in their assumptions and in their confirmation that this is happening would be the subject of perhaps another day. This is not our focus. Our focus is on what the writers are focusing on, which is proving that tradition can be tailored, can be tweaked, so that they can serve purposes. Okay, so let me talk about Ireland in terms of geography, in terms of perhaps division, in terms of denominations, and the setup or the makeup of Ireland. If you look on the map, you would see that Ireland, like I said, is in the north of Europe, and where you have Britain neighboring it from the east. Ireland is made up of 32 counties. 26 of these counties make the Republic of Ireland, the now Republic of Ireland, which is, we can call it mainland Ireland, for example. It's the bulk of Ireland. And you have 6 other counties to the north of Ireland. And those 6 counties have a special status because of their affiliation and their union with Britain. Okay, so what do we call those 6 counties and the people who inhabit them, and what do we call the rest of Ireland? The people who inhabit and live in Northern Ireland in the north, in the 6 counties that are affiliated and linked to Britain, they are called Unionists. Unionists in the sense that they want to be part of Britain. They say there should be a union with Britain. We believe that in the best interest of Ireland as a whole, there should be a union with Britain. They are called Unionists accordingly, and they are also called Loyalists. Loyalists, and they are loyal to whom? They are also loyal to the British Crown. to Britain. They are, in terms of denomination, Christian denomination, they are Protestant. The rest of Ireland, is Catholic. So Catholicism is the religion of most of Ireland, except for the north, where we have the Unionists, we have the Anglo-Irish, and they are for the most part Protestant. Okay? Because of their affiliation and their link and their loyalty to the British Crown, to Britain, the Protestants in the north, in Northern Ireland, used to enjoy privileges that were denied the rest of Ireland. So the rest of Ireland were not, or did not enjoy the privileges that were given to Northern Ireland, to the Anglo-Irish in the north. And this is, of course, going to create a lot of animosities and hatred between and among the Irish. The rest of the Irish in the other parts of Ireland will feel alienated. They will feel estranged, and they would feel bad about it. The fact that Britain is prizing the North over the rest of Ireland. You have a few who enjoy everything, and you have the majority who are denied everything. Again, the few are in the North are the Unionists, and they are Protestant for the most part. The rest of Ireland are Republican. They would like to see this day and this time when Britain leaves their country once and for all. So the rest of Ireland are Catholic, and they are denied lots of the rights that the North used to enjoy. Again, this would last for years and years. And again, the Irish, or the rest of Ireland, the Catholic Islands, or the Catholic Irish will have political activism, and they would try to kind of restore some of their rights. At the beginning, they would try that using peaceful means. They would try to convince British rule that this is not good and there has to be reforms, political and administrative, so that the majority would have some of the rights. They would succeed, and we have examples of that down through the ages, especially in the early 19th century. At one point, we would have this Catholic emancipation, and the Catholic emancipation would be an act passed by the Parliament, the British Parliament, in which the Catholics, the Catholic majority would have some of the rights that they had been denied, or they had been denied for centuries. The fact that it was called Catholic emancipation would create friction and division between the Catholics and also the Protestants. The Protestants will feel alienated will feel left out, and they would feel that the Catholics are doing stuff for themselves. It's not the unifying cause that everybody is after. And over time, there will follow a number of reforms. Those reforms are going to be administrative and administrative and social. And the one who is going to be masterminding those would be Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell is very important. Is a very important name in the history of Ireland. He was a community organizer, and he was an excellent campaigner. He would campaign for rights, and he would succeed. And those rights were, for the most part, administrative rights and also social rights. And the idea of social reform, the idea of land reform. We spoke about land reform and said whenever we have a revolution and whenever we have unrest and whenever we have different situations evolving out of those episodes of unrest, the first thing that people ask for would be land reform. And this is exactly what happened. You need to know that Ireland in the 19th century and prior was, for the most part, owned. I'm talking about lands, the lands that people would cultivate and plant, where the lands were for the most part owned by the Anglo-Irish. The Protestants, they owned, thousands of acres of land, and they would have the rest of Ireland working for them. And of course, the tension that normally happens between the owner of the land and the tenants, the people who work the land for money. Typically, and as in any culture, you normally have a great deal of injustice where you don't have a fair distribution of the land, where you normally have a few people owning everything and leaving very small stuff, very small parts or pieces for the majority. This is actually what the people of Ireland and their representatives in the parliament will work on, and they would succeed in turning this over, where eventually, and by the end of the 19th century, would have a number of parliamentary acts that would restore the land to the Irish and to the Irish majority, to the Catholics. This was a big achievement, and that would be followed by, like I told you, by political activism that would promote the idea of Ireland as an independent state, and eventually they will get that. Let's talk about two important events in the history of Ireland, and like I said, those two very important events are perhaps responsible for the free Ireland that we have now. The first event, as I told you, would be the famine that took place in 1945, and it would stay for 5 years. And the famine of course, is bad news for the Irish, and it's going to also be bad news for the English. The Irish would starve to death. Large segments of the population will starve to death, and large segments would immigrate and travel outside the country, fleeing the famine. Um, on the other hand, that would also be bad news for the British government because the British government did not manage the crisis well. It left people to die. It was not very wise with the management of the crisis. So, what would that leave the British? It would leave them in bad shape in front of and in the eyes of the Irish. The Irish, until and up till this moment, were only asking for home government, for home rule. They wanted was to have people from among themselves governing them under British rule. They would agree that British rule stays, but they want their own people to govern them. So they never thought of independence, see? But when the Irish famine struck, they started to reconsider um, that stand, and they looked at how the British handled the crisis, of course, in a very poor way, and they would decide that no, we don't want these people anymore. And instead of having a home government, we would ask for complete independence, which what they got in 1920 something, right? So this is number one. The second major event that would also flip the whole situation and turn the whole deal upside down would be the events in Easter 1916. What happened during these 5 or 6 days? Um, um, a number of Irish nationalists asked people to take to the streets to protest against the bad situation of the Irish, to ask for reforms, to even request independence from Ireland. If you still remember, they occupied the the General Post Office, and they declared that they are now a provisional government of the independent state of Ireland. Again, this was violent because the English and the British would react very violently, and hundreds of people would get killed on either side, of course, and there is going to be hundreds of casualties. Again, order was restored after perhaps 5 or 6 days. So what did the British do? They brought and they could arrest the leaders of the movement, and they would have them all hanged and executed. So there was no tolerance. The way they treated the leaders of the movement was very upsetting for the Irish. And again, like I said, they would be more than adamant when it comes to the idea of, let me finish, please.
I will ask you, this is which movement?
I didn't get your question.
This is which movement? I see there is many movements in this story. So
No, we're talking about 1916, Easter 1916.
okay.
Okay, so again, I'm talking about those two events that were transformational, that would change everything. So after them, people wouldn't settle for self-government and full stop. They would ask for more. What is it that they are asking for now? They are asking for complete and total independence. Again, you have, of course, the British to blame for that. Again, the preferential treatment, the fact that they were treating the Anglo-Irish in the north better than the rest of Ireland, that would be a good reason why people would revolt and would be upset. And the other reason would be the way they handled the potato famine of 1845. And the third reason would be how they also mishandled the events in Easter 1916, and the fact that they killed or executed the leaders of the Easter 1916 movement. Okay, so what happens after? Life is different, right? People are more adamant than ever about having complete independence, which they get, or which they got. When did they got complete independence? Was it in, I think it was in 1921. There was this treaty between the Irish and the English, in which, the Irish would be granted independence, but the Ireland, or Northern Ireland, the six counties that we spoke about would have special status. They are not going to be part of the rest of Ireland. They're going to be part of the independent counties, the other 26 independent counties. That would come into effect in 1922, and the struggle over time will turn from having independence, because they have already gotten it, to asking for the reunification of Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. And this is what the people are doing until this moment. Okay. Again, we're talking about nationalists and Republicans, people who would like to see Ireland independent of Britain, and we normally refer to them as nationalists, and we refer to the whole movement as the nationalist movement. So to say nationalism would be a misnomer. Misnomer means it's not a very accurate word, because actually we had a number of nationalist movements, and those different nationalist movements have people from different strands, from different walks of life, from even different denominations, whether they were Catholic or Protestant. Will Again, if you are a freedom fighter, and if you're asking for independence and you're fighting for it, you will have to have the backing of your own people. Your own people have to, the people that you're fighting for would have to be convinced of how noble your cause is. So it is true that you're doing everything for them, but if you tell them that you're doing this, you're going to perhaps resort to violent acts in order to secure independence for them, they would say no. No, it's better to have stability and order than to have unrest. So that's why you would need to walk the extra mile in order to convince them that you will have to momentarily use violence so that you can achieve independence and everything. So the nationalists, in order to secure the support of their own people, their own Irish people, they would uh, um, tell the Irish about their history. They would say, listen, you are as good as the British, you have as glorious uh, a history as that of the British, we have our own legacies. At one point, we had our independent country. Why would you settle for living under occupation under extreme conditions? No. And they started, the nationalists, they started to go back in history, perhaps thousands of years, in order to restore people's confidence in themselves. They would tell them, listen, at one point we had our own kings. Listen, at one point when Christianity started, we were among the first people to have to have our own even style of Christianity that everybody speaks about and honors. Okay, so together with the political activism and people would also use cultural means. They would revive people's interest in Irish history in the past. And it's history that they are going to go back to, its culture that they are going to go back to, and also literature and an Irish mythology. Okay, so you would have political nationalism where the focus is on, bringing back the rights of the Irish through sometimes, politics, and some other time through violence and violent activism. And along with that, you would have this cultural revivalism where they would revive people's interest in their own history, the Irish history, and trying to perhaps glorify their forefathers, their ancient, kings and rulers. They would also revive the language, the Gaelic language, the fact that before the advent of the British, people, or the people of Ireland used to have their own language, which is called Gaelic. Again, they would also go back to the literature and the culture of ancient Ireland. They would get inspired. The modern writers would get inspired by themes and ideas from Irish mythology. Somebody's raising her hand. Sausan, go ahead.
Is that what you are talking about right now? Is that about how nationalists use the tradition to build a nationalist ideology?
Yeah. Partly, this is what I'm talking about. The idea that in order to bring people on board with you, in order for them to get convinced of your cause, which is liberating Ireland in the final analysis, and eventually you would have to revive their confidence in themselves. And how can they get that? or how can they achieve that? They can achieve that if they get to know that their history was as glorious as that of the British, if they know that they also had legacies, cultural legacies, they also have their own mythologies, they also have their own kings and queens in the past. And this is actually what we did, or what they did.
Is that associated with the invention of tradition?
We'll talk about that.
Okay, thank
you. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is all the context that we're working within and against. What the chapter is, or the writers of the chapter are trying to say, is that reviving tradition and going all the way back to the history of the natives of a certain country is good and everything, but sometimes what happens is that people, uh, you know, um, mess with this history, if you like, mess with these sets of traditions, and they don't present them as is. They create and craft new traditions that are, of course, positive and glorious, in order for those sets of traditions to be appealing to the modern people. And of course, if they do that, this is dishonesty. According to the writers of the chapter, this is dishonesty and it has to stop. They would say there is nothing, of course, wrong with going all the way back to your history if you have one, to go all the way back to your tradition if you have one, provided that you present the good and the bad. But from their observations, and the writers of the chapter, from their observations, they have found that people mess with those sets of traditions, with their historical events, and they only present whatever is bright, whatever is positive, and they leave behind whatever is negative and whatever is, perhaps tragic and bad and everything. The whole focus of the two writers is on just that, proving that reviving tradition is not normally an innocent act. People who do it have their own agendas, have their own political agendas. And in this case, they would say that the way we approach events in the past, the way we approach tradition as historians would be different from the way nationalists, from the way the nationalists would approach their own history, because nationalists have a vested interest. They have their own agenda, and their own agenda would be to kind of present a history and a set of traditions that would appeal to the modern people. And in order for those pieces of tradition and those historical events to appeal to people in the modern time, they have to be beautiful and they have to be positive. And again, no history, according to those writers, is purely beautiful, purely positive. There are, black spots that the nationalists overlook or do not talk about in a deliberate way, and this is what they take against them, and this is what they focus on. their message to the readers, their message to us, I mean, I'm talking about the writer's message to us. Their message is that we shouldn't take history and historical events for granted. We shouldn't take tradition for granted. We need to question and challenge them because there is a great deal that is left untold, negative as it is, bad as it is. Okay? So the writers of the chapter are against that, are against tweaking history and tradition so that it can serve modern political purposes, no matter how noble the purpose is. Okay, this is basically what the chapter revolves around. The context that we have provided, historical, and the ideas that the writers are trying to communicate to us. The idea that people shouldn't take tradition and history for granted. They should question them, they would challenge them, they should perhaps deconstruct them so that they can get what is truthful and honest and what is not. What else I wanted to talk about? I wanted to also highlight the idea that we have, like I said, political nationalism, where you normally have the names of people like those who were responsible for the unrest of 1916 Easter. And you would also have people like, still remember this guy's name? What's his name? Do I have him? Yes. Daniel O'Connor. Actually, you have the names of four people. Of course, the history of Ireland is full of, good people, but we're singling out perhaps four people because they were very transformational, and they were each one of them is obviously responsible sorry, for a part. Like I said, Daniel O'Connell would be known and credited for the administrative and the social reforms that he lobbied for and that he campaigned for. If you talk about Thomas Davis, Thomas Davis is also credited for the idea of bringing back history and reviving interest in the history of ancient Ireland. The kings of Tara, the pagan kings of Ireland, and also the religious history of Ireland as one of the first countries to embrace Christianity. You have Douglas Hyde, and with Douglas Hyde, the focus would be on reviving the Irish language, the Gaelic language. You would say that the language, if we're having our own independent language, that would be good. It can also be a unifying element. And we also have W. Butler Yeats. And W. Butler Yeats, or W.B. Yeats, is responsible for the cultural and the literary revival. The fact that he would at one point establish, along with Lady Gregory, a theater, a national theater, in which, or on whose stage they would create and perform plays that are inspired by ancient culture, ancient Irish mythology and history. And then we have what else? Yeah, we have the poem written by W.B. Yeats, and the poem is called Easter 1916, and in which he would record the events. He would document the events. Having the poem would document what happens in Easter or at Easter 1916. What is interesting about the poem is that he wasn't there. He was not an eyewitness to the events, but he heard about them and he reacted. But it doesn't seem that people are happy about how he reacted, because he was ambivalent, and the poem shows ambivalence towards the events. You don't really know on which side he is on. At one point, he would say that what happened was perhaps a new dawn, a new light. And at another point, he would say that what are the achievements? What is it that we achieve if we have lots of people dying and we having lots of casualties? So this ambivalence was not well received by the Irish. People would perhaps accuse him of trying to appease the occupier, the British, because he is such an international figure. In order to advance his own interests, he would maintain this kind of balance, unfair balance between the occupiers and his own people. This is basically what the chapter is about. Do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Is it clear now?
No, thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Can we have a class tomorrow, a revision class tomorrow?
Okay.
So what time is?
Like today, Doctor.
Lesson
Yes,
time.
like
Lesson.
today.
Lesson.
Like, oh,
Lesson.
same time. Okay.
Thank you so much.
We'll try to
For
finish.
good job.
We'll finish. We don't have time, obviously, right? Because your exam is on Monday, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So we'll have the rest of the chapters. We'll talk about them, and try to prepare so that you can come up with questions that we can answer. Okay. On this note and with this item, we'll come to the end of today's revision class. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.